Hello folks, and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is a long anticipated one. We are starting my guide on septum stretching. Now this guide is going to be broken up into 2, maybe 3 parts. We're going to start off today with standard septum stretching using round pieces. After this, I'll move on to stacking, and I think I might do a 3rd part on styling a stack because a lot of y'all were interested in me doing that. Now I'm going to try and make it so that you can watch each one, regular standard septum stretching and stacking, independently of each other, but if I'm being honest, it's probably going to be really beneficial to watch both just to make sure you get a full picture of the different methods of septum stretching and how they can affect your nose. Now before we get started, and I'm going to say this anytime I talk about stretching, is that all stretching should be considered permanent. There is this concept online of like a size of no return, a size that once you stretch beyond, your piercing will never shrink or go smaller, but as long as you stay at that size or smaller, the piercing will always shrink or close, and that simply just does not exist. I've seen people stretch their septum only to a 12 or a 10 gauge and have it always stay at that size. I've seen people go all the way up to a 2 or a 0 gauge and have their septum shrink all the way back down to a 16 or an 18. Bodies are really variable, so anytime we're considering stretching, we really want to make sure that we accept that it's going to be a permanent modification and it may not shrink or close. Now when it comes to septum stretching, it's definitely pretty different from ear stretching, and the primary difference is that you're stretching cartilage. Now I know a lot of folks are like, oh, but my septum is pierced in a sweet spot, Lynn. That means it's not cartilage, it's just skin. Well, I'm here to tell you that your sweet spot is still cartilage. The sweet spot, or the little soft squishy area at the tip of the nose where we place septum piercings, is what's called the alar cartilage. It's softer, more flexible cartilage at the tip of the nose, but at the end of the day, it's still cartilage. This means stretching your septum, and honestly stretching any cartilage, is a totally different ballgame than stretching soft tissue like earlobes. With ears, we're typically waiting 6 to 12 weeks, around the 2 to 3 month mark before we're stretching our ears between each size. Some people can stretch their septum at this speed, but honestly, a lot of people need to go way slower because it is through cartilage. It is not uncommon if you're stretching your septum to need to wait 3, 5, 7 months between sizes. This is not a fast process, so if you're planning on stretching your septum, please make peace with being patient. Because if you think a blowout or a tear in your ears is bad, imagine one in your nose. Now, when we're talking about stretching your septum, one of the key elements is placement. It's really important if you're planning on stretching your septum that it's properly placed to accommodate for stretching. If your piercing is too high or too low or too far back, you're not through that alar cartilage that's going to be very easy and comfortable to stretch. You're through the more structural cartilage, potentially even the septal cartilage in your nose, and that is going to be a nightmare to stretch. When we look at the anatomy of the nose, we have a lot of really hard, dense cartilage structures all surrounding that alar cartilage at the tip of our nose. And if our piercing is placed through that cartilage and we try and stretch it, it's going to be really painful. It's going to be really difficult to stretch. We're going to be at a higher risk of blowouts and tears and problems. We also start running the higher risk of some things like denting or drooping far earlier on. And I'm going to go over those in just a second here. But it's really important that you've got your septum placed properly. So if you have any concerns that your septum might not be pierced well, if it might be too low or too far back or too high, definitely have your piercing assessed and make sure that it's placed well for stretching. If it is, awesome, you're good to go. If it's not, you could always consider having it re-pierced, and depending on your anatomy and your goals, you could always have it re-pierced at a slightly larger size, like a 12 or a 10 or an 8 gauge, to help you jumpstart that stretching process and kind of get you a little bit further along. And I know when I talk about this, a lot of people are like, oh, but I don't want to have to get it re-pierced and heal it all over again. I just want to start stretching. But think about it this way. Like I said earlier, septum stretches can sometimes take many months between sizes. So if you have like a too low septum piercing and you know you want to stretch, if you were to get that re-pierced at an 8 gauge, you're already at an 8 gauge. If you were stretching, you wouldn't be at that size for months and months and months. So yes, having to remove your piercing and get it redone seems like a hassle, but if that ends up being what's safest for your nose and allows things to be placed well, you're actually going to jumpstart your process. So it's kind of a win-win. The next step in stretching your septum is making sure you've got the right jewelry. I've talked about it a bunch on my page, but the jewelry that you use for stretching, especially the quality and the make of the pieces, is really important to how successful your stretching journey is or not. If you're using low quality jewelry, unsafe shapes, poor designs, you're at a higher risk of dealing with irritation, blowouts, tears, and on ears, this can already make it really difficult to stretch and get to your goal size. But again, with a septum, we're talking about cartilage, so that makes it twice as important to make sure you're using something safe. In the early stages, implant grade captive bead rings and circulars are great for stretching with. Captives can be super affordable, circulars can still be flipped and hidden, and they're both pretty secure styles. You can also potentially stretch with retainers if you find that those are going to be easier for you to flip, but retainers can be easier to fall out, so that can be difficult for some folks. As you go up, a lot of folks end up going with pinchers for stretching because they prefer the look of them. And with pinchers, we can get a pretty small diameter, so it'll still sit nice and snug in your nose. Now, some people love the look of really big chunky jewelry and opt to go with huge circulars and huge captives for the stretching process. I personally think this aesthetic looks amazing. It's super dope, and these pieces are awesome for stretching with as well. One thing to bear in mind if you are someone who prefers the aesthetic of these really big rings is that as you're stretching up, these rings can start to get pretty heavy, and that weight can be sometimes irritating on some people's septums. So if you are stretching with these big pieces, keep that in mind, and if you notice the weight or the size of them is starting to cause irritation or issues, consider swapping to just like a small plug or an eyelet, at least for a little bit, to give your nose a break. Now, alternatively, if you need to be more conservative with how your septum looks while you're stretching it, or you just don't want to deal with really giant jewelry hanging down, or a pincher, which pinchers love to fall out. I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. They really do fall out very easily. They can be kind of annoying with septum stretching because they do fall out so easily, but they're really affordable, they're a comfortable shape, and if you're stretching on a budget, pinchers are gonna be awesome for you. Just understand that they can be kind of hard to get to stay in. You can always stretch with single flare plugs, and for people who really needed to have their piercing be more discreet during the stretching process and hide it, and they couldn't really deal with flipping stuff up after a certain size, I've had custom shorter wearable single flare plugs made from Glassware Studios and Gorilla Glass, and those are super affordable for septum stretching. The other key thing to consider about jewelry when it comes to stretching is sizing. Not everyone is going to be able to size up their septum in full 1 millimeter increments. Many folks are going to need to go by 0.5 millimeter increments, or what we call half sizes. And that's because these are halfway in between each 1 millimeter jump. So let's say you're at a 6 gauge and you're trying to go to 4 and it is just not happening for you. A 6 is 4 millimeters and a 4 is 5 millimeters. So consider getting a 4.5 millimeter plug or pincher or whatever you prefer to wear, and that will probably help you on your stretching journey. Now, when it comes to materials, implant grade titanium and steel are both super safe, and when we're talking about captives, they can be pretty affordable. They do get pricey when it comes to circulars, but circulars can be really easy to stretch with, and a lot of clients love the aesthetic, so I do think it's worth the investment. We can also do things like pinchers and plugs in glass, which is super hypoallergenic, body safe, and affordable. There are also makers who can work with Delrin and PTFE, two body safe plastics. Before someone's like, but Lynn, body safe plastic jewelry. Delrin and PTFE are safe, but there's just no current way to machine them in small sizes for regular piercings. But once you have a stretched piercing that's large enough, like a septum, a labret, or your ears, you can definitely get Delrin and PTFE safely from reputable makers. So those are options as well. What I would caution you to stay away from is acrylic, especially those super cheap acrylic kits online. Not only is acrylic a bad idea, but in your nose, I've seen some bad stuff. Please do not do that to yourself. And those crappy like surgical steel septum stretching kits that you see on like Amazon and Body Art Forms and stuff. It's just super, super low quality. So many people have allergic reactions and irritations to it, and it's just not worth it. Now, some quick tips when it comes to jewelry before we move on. A lot of folks are going to end up wearing O-rings with jewelry they use to stretch in your septum. Remember how I mentioned earlier that pinchers can be really easy to fall out? Using O-rings on either side can kind of help make them a little bit more secure. It's not that much more secure. They still do like to fall out, but it's definitely a little bit. Or if you're using single flare glass plugs, you're gonna need an O-ring for one side or the other. A lot of folks can have bad reaction to nitrile O-rings. Those are the black O-rings that you especially see in a lot of the cheaper kits online. Try and get silicone O-rings, which are the clear O-rings. Most companies carry them. Glassware Studios, who I work with, I think works with them exclusively just because they're safer, but I see a lot of folks encounter issues with stretching, especially in their septum, because it's a mucous membrane that's more sensitive, and it ends up coming down to the O-ring. They're just having a reaction to that nitrile O-ring. So look for the clear O-rings. Those are typically silicone, and generally avoid the black O-rings, which tend to be nitrile, or sometimes I've even seen them in latex. They can definitely cause reactions, especially in your nose. Now, the process of actually stretching your septum. A lot of times people are going to end up needing to use tools to assist with septum stretching, and that's because we are stretching through cartilage. A lot of times the earlier sizes, especially if you've had your septum pierced for a while and it feels pretty loose, those can just be naturally stretched or dead stretched, where you can just slide the next size right in. For example, plenty of clients just take out a 16 gauge captive and they can pop a 14 gauge captive right in, easy peasy, no problem. Same for a lot of folks between 12 and 10 gauge. One thing I will say is if this is what you're trying to do, captives are going to be easier for this than circulars. Circulars have that flat edge where the threading for the bead is, and that can sometimes be really difficult to use to get in for dead stretching. Captives have those nice rounded edges, and that tends to be a little bit gentler. But for many folks, even though it's in their alar cartilage, even though it's in their nice sweet spot, it's still cartilage and it still does not want to stretch. And this is where tools come in. Septum stretching oftentimes is going to involve the use of tapers in order to be able to get you up to your next size. Now, when it comes to using tapers, they are not all created equally. Cheap tapers you can buy online tend to have really poor surface finish and a really extreme graduation in the taper. I'm gonna throw up a picture example here. Do you see this spot that I've circled where it kind of just rapidly jumps between sizes? That means all of that stretch is happening on that small portion of taper. Now, let's take a look at some really high quality tapers. These are from Anatometal, and look at this long, gentle taper. The first thing you'll notice immediately is that these are long, and the graduation between sizes is smooth. That jump is not happening in this tiny little gap like on that cheap taper. It's actually happening very gradually over the entire length of the tool. This difference in quality tapers makes all the difference when we're stretching, and especially stretching cartilage, because when we use tapers that have these teeny tiny little graduations, they force the stretch to happen in this one small area, and you can still end up blowing out. Whereas when we use quality tapers that are actually designed for purposes like stretching cartilage, that's what this taper is a picture of. This is a taper that I have custom made from Anatometal for stretching cartilage with. The taper and the graduation happens over the entire length of the piece, so it's a smooth, gentle stretch. Really high quality tapers can be pricey, especially depending on how large you're going, so some clients do choose to just be stretched in person at their studio. That way their piercer can use the tool and then reprocess it. The client doesn't have to purchase it. Other clients don't have access to piercers near them who can help with that, so they'll order these tapers from piercers online. And some folks get lucky and don't need to use tapers on their septums and can just slide in a pincher or a captive or whatever their next size may be. But that's pretty few and far between. Most folks are going to need a tool to help them out with stretching their septum. Now, when it comes to actually performing the stretch, what you'll want is your jewelry and your neck size up. Remember, we're going in 0.5 or 1 millimeter increments. We're not going any larger than that. Tools, if you feel like you're going to need them for your stretch, so the appropriate size taper that's well made with a nice gentle taper. And then some form of lubricant. Most piercing studios have surgical lubricant in stock. It comes in these little single-use packets, and they can give some to you to take home with you. If you don't have access to a studio, a water-based personal lubricant works very well. Water-based being the key word there. Clean your septum piercing well and clean your hands first, and then you can remove the jewelry you're currently wearing. Put a little bit of lubrication on your taper or tool, or put a little bit of lubrication directly on the jewelry if you're naturally stretching, and then gently begin to guide it through. Do not rush with the tool, do not rush with the jewelry, don't like shove it and force it. A gentle, consistent motion through your nose. Once that's through and the jewelry is in, you can clean off any extra lubrication. If you're using something with beads, screw your beads on. If you're using a pincher, pop your O-rings on. And there you go, you've stretched to the next size. Now, some pro tips for stretching. Pro tip 1, because most people are gonna do this in their bathroom because you've got good light and a mirror. Close or cover the sink drain because you're gonna drop jewelry down it. I go as far as to put a towel over my whole sink. That way if jewelry drops, it doesn't bounce and fly away somewhere. That way it hits the nice soft towel and kind of stays where it's at. My second pro tip is to wear gloves. This is not for like a safety purpose, but gloves are really gonna give you a fantastic extra grip, and that can really help you with holding on to the jewelry, screwing on beads, or getting teeny tiny little O-rings onto pinchers. So wearing gloves helps massively with this. Now, a key step in stretching is understanding if it's an appropriate time to stretch or not. Now, ear stretching, it's very easy to do that because ear stretching really shouldn't be painful. If it's hurting, then you're stretching too soon. Ear stretching, you should be able to just massage your ears. You pop them in, they feel like you're putting in an earring. Maybe they feel a little tight, but they don't hurt. Septum stretching is a different ballpark, and I'm going to be honest with you, septum stretching is painful. I describe the sensation of stretching my septum as spicy. It definitely feels like, you ever eat a big thing of horseradish or wasabi and it just like punches you straight in the nose? It can kind of feel like that. Now, a lot of times the stretch itself won't feel super uncomfortable, but you'll wake up the next morning or a morning or two later and you can feel that you have stretched your nose. Your nose is sore and tender and uncomfortable, and sometimes that feeling lasts for weeks. And that's because we're stretching cartilage. And cartilage just simply does not want to be stretched. But if you are trying to put your septum in and you're meeting a ton of resistance, your nose just does not want to go to the next size, and you're going to have to use a fair amount of force, and it feels really painful, almost like a blinding or like a stabbing pain up through your nose, that's a sign that your nose isn't ready yet. And I know that that can be frustrating after waiting a while, but take the jewelry out, take the taper out, put your smaller size back in, and give it more time. Septum stretching is not a fast process, and I had to wait sometimes 7 or 8 months or longer between sizes because my nose was simply taking longer to loosen up. Now, there are 2 other elements that can affect how our septum stretch is going to feel and when our nose is ready, and that is denting and drooping. Septum dent is the process by which, as we're stretching and enlarging our septum, it begins to press against the hard septal cartilage that makes up the center of our nose. Once we run into that hard cartilage, there's really nowhere else for our jewelry to go. And for people who have smaller sweet spots, for people whose piercings were not placed well for stretching, or for people whose nose anatomy just puts their septal cartilage right there, they're gonna dent pretty quickly on. With denting, you kind of just force the jewelry in anyway, and it eventually erodes and wears down at that septal cartilage and creates a dent in it where the jewelry sits. Denting, notoriously, is incredibly, incredibly painful. For most folks, if they've got a well-placed septum piercing for stretching, they're not going to encounter denting in any of the smaller sizes. Most of the time, I see people start talking about experiencing denting around 2 gauge, 1 gauge, and 0 gauge. That being said, when I see clients who are stretching incorrectly placed septums, I can see them dent as early as 12 or 10 gauge. This is why having your septum in the right place for stretching is so important. Now, some people do just have really narrow noses and really small sweet spots, and they're gonna dent earlier on. And if you know your plan is stretching when you go and get your septum pierced, your piercer should feel around in your nose and warn you if they think that's something you're gonna encounter. But if that septal cartilage is right there, there's really no other way to go about it than to stretch that jewelry in and allow it to dent and create that little spot for the jewelry to sit. And when you see folks who have really big septums, like 1/2 inch, 5/8, even 3/4 septums, they are getting there by denting. They are simply getting that size in, dealing with the pain and discomfort of denting, and living with it. And it just kind of is what it is. So if you're planning on going pretty large, you should expect to encounter septum denting at some point, and it's not a pleasant process. Now, the other factor is septum droop, and this is the name given to when you're stretching and you stretch large enough that it begins to droop the nose down in the front where the jewelry sits. Like I mentioned, we've only got so much room in our nose, we've only got so much alar cartilage, we're stretching, it's gotta go somewhere. It's either gonna go up against that hard septal cartilage and dent, or it's gonna go down against the tissue at the bottom of your nose and droop and create this bowed out shape. This is significantly more common when we're stretching with circular pieces than with stacking because we're displacing the tissue completely around when we're stretching with a circular piece. For some people, the look of septum droop is super desirable. They like that bowed out look on the nose and think it's really cool and rad. If that's the case for you, awesome. Enjoy it. A lot of folks, however, don't want septum droop and they don't want to deal with changing the entire shape of their nose like this. If that's the case for you, go really slow while you're stretching. Make sure you're stretching a piercing that's placed correctly for stretching, and definitely take pictures and monitor how your nose is sitting from the front and from the side. And when you start to see droop occurring, it may be time to say that that's your goal size. And for some people, septum droop does happen pretty early on. I've seen it happen to people as early as like a 6 or a 4 gauge, depending on the shape of their nose. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, septum stretching should be considered permanent. There's no guarantee it's gonna go back. So definitely consider factors like droop and denting when you're planning to stretch. The other big piece of advice I can give you about septum stretching is to be realistic about your journey. It's really easy to get caught up in a goal size or a goal piece of jewelry or a goal look, but everyone's body and journey and experience with stretching is going to be different. You may encounter denting earlier on than you expected, and it may be way more painful than you want to deal with. You may get to your goal size and decide that you really want to do something bigger and more decorative. Those things are all okay, but especially with stretching cartilage, given how difficult it can be, make sure that you're enjoying the journey as much as you are anticipating the destination. Don't rush through stretches or skip sizes or stretch too quickly just to get there sooner. You can cause so much damage and so much harm to your nose and your piercing this way, and nose surgery, if you need to fix something, is not cheap. Now there's a few last tips that I'd like to give before we close out, just in general when it comes to septum stretching. My first tip is to please avoid silicone until you are super sure a stretch is stabilized and comfortable. Silicone loves to fuse to any tiny little micro tears and any tiny openings or damage to the skin, and when we're stretching cartilage, there's probably going to be micro tears no matter how hard we try and avoid it. Wearing silicone too early on in a freshly stretched septum can absolutely cause it to become stuck or start to fuse to the wall of your septum, and it can cause so much damage when it's removed. Silicone eyelets should only be worn well after a stretch is established and you're sure that it's going to be safe and comfortable to do so. Be smart about when you're choosing to stretch your septum. If you know that during the winter months you always have a runny, sore, tender nose from the cold, you're probably going to find stretching in the winter months way harder. If you know that you have terrible seasonal allergies come spring and your nose is going to be swollen and inflamed, you may have a harder time stretching around that. Make sure to keep your timelines flexible for what's going on with your body as well. And reach out. There's a lot of good resources online about septum stretching. There's a lot of piercers with a lot of experience with septum stretching who can help you. And there is still a very active septum stretching forum on Facebook, which does have a lot of really good resources for people who are interested. But you definitely don't need to go this journey alone. Septum stretching, because it can be painful and uncomfortable, it can be really hard to determine, especially when you're starting out, if a stretch is safe, if you're pushing it too far, if you're dealing with a blowout or a tear, what's going on. So use your piercer as a resource, use good educated forums and groups online as a resource, and just make sure you're being really careful and kind of listening to your body. Now this one was all about stretching with singular round pieces. The next one up in this series is going to be all about septum stacking, which is what I wear in mine, stretching your septum with multiple smaller rings. I'm also going to do a video on styling stacks because there is a lot that goes into styling it to sit well, and I think I'm going to do a video going over the pros and cons of stretching with a round piece versus stacking for folks who are not sure about the differences or not sure which one will be a better fit for them. My goal is to have all of these about septum stacking up by around the middle of November, so stay tuned because there's more coming. And if you have anything else about septum stretching you'd like to see me talk about, leave some suggestions down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like the content I put out, please hit like and subscribe. It means the world to me, and I can't wait to sit down and chat more with y'all about this soon. Have an awesome rest of your day, and happy stretching!